Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Climate risk is escalating and costing our communities. 1.5 degrees is not a goal or a target. It is an important threshold beyond which scientists around the globe have identified. It is the point beyond which climate risk will accelerate, impacting every aspect of our economy, our environment and communities. The government is not doing all it can to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and mitigate that risk. It continues to approve extension of coal and gas projects well beyond 2050. Diligent measuring and monitoring of all emissions, in particular methane emanating from its extraction and transport of gas, including from open-cut coal mines. Methane traps more heat in the atmosphere per molecule than CO2, making it 80 times more harmful than CO2 for 20 years after its release. Australia has signed the Global Methane Pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And the interjections from members of the coalitions are not surprising, because we know they do not want to act on climate change. They want to continue seeing their communities exposed to escalating risks without mitigating. And who will pay the cost? Communities will pay the cost. Now, in relation to methane, Australia has signed with the Global Methane Pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. However, our laws do not require facilities to actually measure, monitor and capture, where possible, methane emissions. In 2019, our current flawed measuring methane made up 68% of Australia's emissions from the energy industry overall, and we are not yet on track to achieving that net zero by 2050. And so there is compelling evidence of gross underreporting of fugitive methane emissions from Australian mines and gas facilities based on its analysis by the International Energy Agency's satellite data published in its Global Methane Tracker. The International Energy Agency highlights that methane emissions from oil and gas are some of the easiest to abate if appropriately monitored and measured, and if that is implemented. So we should have global best practice on measuring, monitoring and reporting methane, especially as we are the 11th highest methane emitter globally and 10th percent of our national emissions are fugitive. There's a growing body of evidence that highlighting the gross underreporting of methane emissions, particularly from other fugitive emissions from open-cut mines, oil and gas extraction. The ACF's annual Australian Methane Plume Summary 2023 shockingly reported Glencore's Howe Creek mine is suspected to have at least one super-emitting event with over a 16-day period, some 60 times higher methane emissions than what is in fact reported or offset. The Global Methane Tracker of 2024 suggests Australia is underreporting its methane emissions by up to 64%. So this underreporting is significant, not only due to the magnitude of the potential error, but also the high contribution methane makes to Australia's overall emission profile and the liabilities associated with these emissions under the safeguard mechanism. The evidence this evidence has been put to the government, and the government is on notice that Australia has an emissions reporting problem, and it is undermining not only the safeguard mechanism, but our international commitment under the Paris Agreement and Global Methane Pledge. The review of the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme by the Climate Change Authority recommended mandatory measurement, reporting and independent verification of methane emissions. An investment in emissions monitoring infrastructure is necessary for that full implementation of these recommendations, but unfortunately there was nothing in the last budget from the government to address that. Further, the government has now missed its statutory deadline to respond to the review's recommendations to fix methane reporting. It's now 2 weeks overdue, and at a time where the Minister for the Environment continues to approve further gas projects well into the future, that is negligent. The Australian government must urgently address methane emissions in both the agricultural sector and the coal and gas sector. May I remind the House and people out there, the first impacted by a warming climate will be those relying on the environment for their living. For example, in the agriculture sector, the warnings are dire that that sector will not survive, the crops will not survive the kind of predicted temperature changes and climate changes that are coming. So I urge the government, I urge the coalition, Come to your senses and start acting on this threat.